I'd like to introduce Dr. Ericka Lewis. Dr. Lewis is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. Her research examines the risk and protective factors that influence family functioning and child well-being. Dr. Lewis will present findings from an external evaluation of the Quality Parenting Initiative, also known as QPI, which is an effort to promote high-quality foster care by strengthening partnerships among foster care stakeholders. And following Dr. Lewis's 30-minute presentation, Jennifer Rodriguez will join Ericka to answer questions about QPI. Jennifer is a lawyer and the executive director of the Youth Law Center, a national public interest law firm. Jennifer is a co-founder of YLC's Quality QPI, Quality Parenting Initiative. Jennifer's passion for systems change is based on her own experiences growing up in foster care and decades of working with youth to involve them in leading policy change. So now we're going to hear from Ericka. Her presentation is entitled, "It's Possible, Cultivating Positive Relationships Between Birth and Foster Parents." Welcome, Ericka.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate you. Thanks, Crystal. All right, so if we could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. I'd love to start out with just acknowledgements and thank yous for the work that I'm going to be presenting today. So being able to work with the Youth Law Center and QPI's administrative staff and leadership has been wonderful, as well as me being able to go to QPI sites. And so I was able to go to 3 sites and I had site visits. And so shout out to Kate Rickford and Aspire. They were one of the places that I was able to visit during the research and collecting the data, as well as the birth and foster parents who were willing to share their time to really answer the questions that I had and just talk about their experiences. I also wanted to thank our funding support, which was Annie E. Casey. Oh, I've thanked a lot of people. It feels like it's award season now, so I feel like I should thank my manager, my agent, maybe God. I think so. Thanks. All right, we'll go to the next slide. So today we're going to be talking about 3 major topics. The first one is this idea of the importance of stakeholder relationships in foster care. Also, I'd like to spend some time describing Quality Parenting Initiative, QPI, and its impact on the birth and foster family or foster parent relationship. The last thing we're going to talk about is identifying strategies that really promote this positive working relationship across stakeholders. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you back. Imagine 2019, the end of April, I am sitting at my first QPI national conference. And it happens to be that the subject is on building a relationship-based system. Every day of the conference, they had a word of the day. And the day that I attended, the word was relationships. So I sat in this large auditorium with small tables of 8 to 10 people, and they're talking, people are laughing, people are sharing ideas. And I came to find out through the presentations, as well as my time with the participants there, attendees, that there were stakeholders who were active not only in the conference, but just at their foster care agency and through their system. So I'm talking birth parents, foster parents, former youth in care, providers. And there was this energy that just was palpable. And it was just folks working together and really solving problems. And it was around this idea of relationships, but I saw it in real time. So it was fascinating to me. And it felt like the takeaway message there was partnerships were important and relationships mattered. And I was intrigued to find out what it was about QPI and the way in which they implement insights that creates this type of collaboration and this energy that I couldn't quite describe, but I wanted to understand how that was. And so now I find myself here after a research study being able to answer some of that. Thank you. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to talk about foster parents as stakeholders. So, I mean, you see the numbers here on the slide. I mean, considering the most recent annual reports of the number of children who are placed in foster care, high quality foster parenting is vital. This is vital to ensuring safety, permanency, and well-being of children in care. You know, foster family homes they're considered the preferred out-of-home placement. And this is because foster families provide stable living environments where children can develop secure attachments and form trusting relationships with caregivers. And we know that these relationships are needed for children's social, emotional, and behavioral development. The previous studies have found nurturing and positive caregiving relationships to be associated with decreased high-risk behaviors and an increase in feelings of safety and well-being among foster or youth that are in foster care. Next slide, please. So really to ensure this, that there is effective care coordination for youth in care, foster parents are often encouraged to develop and maintain working relationships. And these are with a variety of stakeholders. So we're talking birth parents, foster care agency personnel, and of the like. And there's several studies that have found that the quality of working relationships between foster parents and agency staff, they found it to be associated with foster parent outcomes, such as role satisfaction and retention. There's also this idea of positive communication with agency personnel, and it's important to note that foster parents have to feel valued and respected as members of the team. And when those feelings exist, then it has been shown to improve foster parent satisfaction and their commitment to their role of fostering. Studies have also shown that positive working relationships are also a critical component of successful family reunification. And they've even been linked to birth parent and child outcomes. So for example, there have been studies that have found that less tension between birth and foster parents during, say, family visits, that there's a correlation between that and increases in birth parents visiting frequency, and that's also related to stronger birth parent-child attachments. So taken together, you know, given the role of foster parents in not only providing care and this continuity of care, but also promoting child well-being, that child welfare agencies are really interested now in finding strategies to improve the working relationship among foster parents and among stakeholders, but specifically foster parents and birth parents. And we're going to talk about one of these approaches today, which is QPI. Next slide, please. So QPI is a systems change approach, and it's designed to improve the quality of foster care services. So they help agencies and systems incorporate best practices and policies. What's important to know about QPI is that it's a collaborative approach, and they're committed to excellent parenting through strong relationships. So there is this emphasis on relationships. So excellent parenting through strong relationships, and these relationships must put the child first. So they have a few key principles. One is that children need excellent parenting. That's both in foster care and once reunification occurs. QPI also believes that parenting and meaningful relationships are one of the most important services that you can provide in foster care. And one of their driving principles would be that stakeholders, they impact and they drive the change. So those who are most impacted by services and policies should be the folks who are driving the change. Next slide, please. So QPI has several activities that help emphasize these principles. I'm just going to highlight a few of them for you today. The first one is that I've really enjoyed getting to know more about is the comfort calls. And so comfort calls are arranged phone calls that are placed between the foster parent and the birth parent, and this is immediately following a new placement. Now, QPI has also collaborated with the Birth and Foster Parent Partnership, and I believe they'll be presenting later today. And they've collaborated to develop guidebooks to help build partnership across stakeholder groups. QPI also has partnership plans and improved transitioning plans. So for partnership plans, that's created by the foster parents and the caseworkers. And this happens at the beginning of a new placement. So it outlines various expectations related to the mutual responsibilities, as well as say performed forms of communication and other ways of information sharing. Next slide, please. So QPI has been, implemented and I'm sure the numbers have probably increased since the time of my research study, but at the time it was 80 jurisdictions and across 10 states. But at the time, there had been no external research that had been conducted to understand the implementation and the impact of QPI. And so this evaluation provided me an opportunity to gain a better understanding of the impact of QPI, and specifically on the relationship building process. So basically, I wanted to be able to describe the collaborative atmosphere that I had experienced and witnessed at the national conference. And I wanted to be able to understand that QPI's impact specifically on that relationship. Next slide. Thank you. So the study aims, now I will say the findings that I'm presenting today, they're part of a larger process evaluation. It took about 2 years. And that process evaluation assessed foster parents' perceptions of QPI satisfaction and their usefulness. And it really explored strategies that engage diverse stakeholders in the QPI process. But for today's presentation, I'm going to focus on foster parents' perceptions of QPI's impact on their experience. And so specifically, I'm talking about establishing and strengthening a relationship with birth parents. Next slide. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Who were the folks? When did it happen? How did it happen? So these were foster parents who were a part of a site that has implemented QPI. So these are licensed foster parents. I conducted 3 site visits, one in Florida, Minnesota, and Louisiana. Now, while the entire evaluation lasted about 2 years, the foster parent interviews that I'm going to discuss today were conducted in the spring and summer of 2019. We did this by conducting individual interviews. So we used the interview guide and we asked questions specifically pertaining to QPI's impact on several factors of the foster parent experience. The interviews lasted on average about 53 minutes, and we used the thematic analysis. And this is a method of, once you've gathered the data, of identifying, analyzing, and reporting patterns that you see within the data, and then reporting those patterns. And those are the themes that I'm going to talk about today. Next slide, please. So these are just a few sample questions that were asked during the interview. So you'll see that there were questions around QPI knowledge, if foster parents were involved in the implementation of QPI. But the themes that I'm talking about today are really around this last domain, around QPI impact. So what improvements have foster parents noticed with their relationship with birth parents? Next slide. So our findings found that, that most foster parents believe that QPI had a positive effect on their relationship with birth parents. So it was interesting because foster parents attributed these positive effects to QPI's cultivation of this team-based approach to meet the best interests of the child. And this was from the beginning, from beginning to end. And so there were 3 themes that were captured around this relationship building process. One was role clarification. The second was the challenging of biases and assumptions. And the third was communication. So the first was role clarification. And so participants discussed how QPI's defining of the expectation for foster parents, as well as birth parents, and the communication of these expectations for all stakeholders really help facilitate that improved relationship. It's important to note that providing this type of clarification on the roles and the expectations really help reduce the tensions that may normally arise between foster parents and birth parents, and it really helped facilitate this relationship building. And so we have our first quote, which is on the right, and it says, you know, when we met mom in the hospital, we were fixing to take her son home, and that's hard for anyone. My wife introduced us, and she's like, we'd like to give you a hug, and we just want you to know that we're here for you. We're gonna love him until he comes back to you. If there's anything you need along the way, you let us know. We exchanged phone numbers. We said we would send her pictures and videos. She could call us. She could FaceTime. She didn't have to just see him that 1 week for the visit. Another foster parent, and this is the quote on the right, talks about how the shared information really helped birth parents understand foster parents' role in the process, and that their role as foster parents was really to support the reunification. So the foster parent says, well, the birth parents were more receptive to me helping them. They're able to see that I'm not the bad guy that came and took their kids from them. I guess they're realizing that I'm here to work with them and help them get their kid back. Thank you. Next slide. And I'll wait. And if you'll just, we'll just keep it at that one quote. Thank you. The next topic, or the next theme we had, was challenging biases. So foster parents discussed how QPI had also helped them acknowledge and address the biases that they had. And these are the biases that they may have held about birth parents in general, as well as their assumption about the need for building relationships with birth parents. Parents explain, or participants explain, that QPI activities like the comfort calls and the transition plans, and also with the help of the agency staff, help encourage their efforts to be intentional in their interactions with birth parents in a different way for them that was more collaborative. So this first quote says, well, the agency staff, they're making sure that we understand our role in it and actively engaging us and following up and saying, okay, how is your relationship with the birth parent? What do you need to do to make it better? Our social worker would ask us those questions. She would follow up and make sure that we were doing our part to work with the parents and have that open communication. So in addition to challenging these biases and assumptions, foster parents also shared that QPI helped them appreciate birth parents' experiences, and this helped them develop a sense of empathy for birth parents. They shared that this empathy had affected the way that they engage with birth parents. One foster parent explained it this way. Next quote, please. We had the impression that we were just not gonna like this guy. And then we met him and we immediately realized our first impression was off. We told him, you can call, you can text, you can whatever. And along the way, we maintained that. He called every night faithfully to sing his son a lullaby. He did that for 5 months until his son went home. Foster parents also believe that birth parents notice the change in their interactions, and they often acknowledge that shift. This same foster parent noted something else that was said to him from the birth father. Get the next quote, please. The birth father said, I just want to thank you because you treated me like a father. You never treated me like someone who lost his son because he was a bad guy and because he did these things. You along the way treated me like a person and you allowed me to be his father. Thank you. Could we go to the next slide? Thank you. So our last theme that we're going to talk about is this idea of communication. So foster parents believe that QPI had positive effects on their relationship with foster parents, and this is particularly communication and intentional interactions. So they sought these opportunities to interact with birth parents positively and collaboratively. And QPI's team-based approach encouraged this communication among, birth and foster parents from the beginning. So this not only made providing care for children and youth easier for foster parents because they learn more from the birth parents about the child, but it also empowered birth parents to be more forthcoming with them about their circumstances and their need for support. And this is without that fear of losing their child. And participants talked about how this strengthened the relationship. And so one parent actually noted this, and we'll take the first quote, please. So now it's like a relationship, almost a friendship, you know? I feel like that's definitely improved. It's allowed for more honesty, and this bio parent has shared more. Foster parents also explained that through QPI, birth parents viewed them as an additional source of support that they could call upon in the future. So there was another quote that I wanted to share with you. And so the foster parent says, well, once that child goes home, those parents have someone to rely on. They can always come back to you or reach out to you if they're in trouble. We built that relationship. They feel comfortable, where they would maybe rely on you to help them out in a bind when they need it, so that their child is not put in danger again. There was another foster parent that spoke about the benefits of this continued relationship between birth and foster parents because foster parents were more supportive. So the birth mom told me that she was really happy to be working with us because all of her friends were in the drug crowd and that drug scene that she was getting out of to get her kid back. She felt like she had nobody to go to anymore because if she went to her friends, she'd just fall back into that cycle. She said that that's been a really positive thing for her to be able to have us to talk to and be able to work with us and have that person to support her so that she's not in that crowd that she was before anymore. I think that birth parents getting a lot more support on their end to be more receptive of us and working with us more. So really taken together, QPI helped foster parents realize that it's in the best interest of the child for all relevant caregivers to communicate effectively, to work collaboratively, and to get along. Next slide, please. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. So now we're getting to the summary of findings. So this is our so what? What are our big takeaways here? Well, hopefully, the findings have shown that relationships do matter. They're really important to this process. And that QPI sites have developed these concrete activities to demonstrate these essential elements, one being the benefits of building relationship across stakeholders. Past research suggests that foster parent engagement with and support for birth parents can reduce parental tension and alleviate fears of having a child in the foster care system. Next slide, please. So it's usually in the child's best interest for birth and foster parents to maintain this positive and supportive relationship. And our findings suggest that foster care agencies may benefit from incorporating these strategies and more opportunities that really promote this frequent positive interactions between birth and foster parents. It's also important to gain a better understanding of the role of foster parents. If you think about it, they have something we like to call this dual role. Not only are they parental figures, but they're also professionals in that being a foster parent is a job. And so with this role of being a parental figure and a professional, sometimes conflict can arise and confusion around when to serve in which role and how serving in one role may then impact their standing in another role. And so it's really important for child welfare professionals and agencies to understand this role a bit more and think about how the role in essence, could create barriers to building stronger foster birth parent relationships. I think finally, child welfare workers who are really intentional about helping to create this kind of environment where stakeholders' relationships can thrive, especially when thinking about the birth and foster parent relationship, that there may be additional tools that are needed in trainings on best practices. And this is specifically so that professionals can help prepare foster parents to effectively engage with birth parents. Because if you think about it anecdotally, at times foster care agencies may have, had this idea and know about the benefit of these relationships, but few places or few agencies have I would say tools or a plan in order to train and implement child welfare professionals on how they can best promote this relationship. Next slide, please. So I will say that we do have a paper out, and it is a wonderful paper. Now, I could be biased, but I think it's a great read. And I think what's most important about it is not only does it talk about the relationships between birth parents and foster parents, but it also talks about the importance of the relationship between foster parents and agency staff and other stakeholders, as well as foster parents having better relationship with fellow foster parents and how that can help strengthen the foster care system and really improve the foster parent experience. So I invite you to read that paper and that article. Next slide. That is all I have for today. So thank you for your time, and I welcome questions. And we'll also have Jennifer from the Youth Law Center here to answer any questions about the study as well as QPI.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, and welcome, Jennifer. Looks like we have about 5 questions in 10 minutes, so we will get through what we're able. I'll just go through the list here. So, sometimes maintain relationships with the child's family is unsafe for the child. If only the foster parent has knowledge of the contact, what is suggested for the agency who is ultimately responsible for the safety of the child in state's custody to be able to ensure the safety of the child? A state agency is limited by the laws and policies that dictate how they care for children in custody. Can or when should this be circumvented on a case-by-case basis without violating any laws or policies that govern the decisions and actions of the agency?
I could start with this. I first wanted to say that the sites that we did, that we conducted the site visits, they were both state and private agencies. And so I think the important point would be that there should be collaboration from the beginning. So there shouldn't be communication in silo where agencies are not aware of the way in which foster parents and birth parents are communicating. And so I think it's up to the foster parent or the foster agencies to set up protocols and strategies and approaches so that communication and these interactions can be not only safe, but also beneficial for the child. And if they are not, then there should be protocols in place because we want these to be quality interactions. But I see that Jennifer may have something to add.
Yeah, I can jump in. Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I wanted to just emphasize what Dr. Lewis said about the processes in a system and how important they are. When we started QPI 14 years ago, we started by actually going and doing listening sessions with youth, with foster parents, with birth parents, with staff. And QPI is actually not about birth and foster parent relationships. It's really about making sure that if we have to remove a child and put them in foster care, that they can receive the excellent parenting every single day that helps to mitigate the trauma of that experience and will really help them grow and thrive. And so our first question to those stakeholders was, what gets in the way of your system of every single child getting the love and nurturing and care that they deserve? And across the board, what we heard from both foster parents and birth parents was the barriers that systems put up in between birth and foster parents working together and collaborating and sharing parenting was one of the barriers that was most important. And so there were birth and foster parents who were in fact working together, but as you heard Sharonda and Katie sharing before, they were having to sneak behind the back of the system to do it and living in fear all the time that they would be accused of violating laws or regulations. Foster parents were worried about losing their license or being disciplined or not getting further placements. And birth parents were worried about reunification being interfered with. And so the work of QPI was really about saying you have to make the practice, policy, and culture changes in your system so that we're never putting a barrier in something that's good for children. And that requires a lot of things. It requires changes from the way that you do removal so that you're talking a particular way when you have to do a removal to the parent around where their child is going and what they can expect in the next 24 hours. It requires changes in the way that you recruit and message what the job of foster parenting is to prospective foster parents. It requires changes in the way you do placements, in the way you do ongoing support for families, and you deal with things like concurrent planning expectations. It requires changes in the way that you return children back to their family. It requires changes in the way that you listen to and you talk to youth who really should have an opinion too, that's listened to about whether and how they want their birth family engaged. So all of those things have to be changed in order for systems to support this effectively and for parents to not be saddled with the responsibility of holding all the work on their own. We want child welfare policy to actually, reflect the interventions that make a positive impact. And to do that, you have to do what Dr. Lewis says. You have to make sure that policy is actually supporting and practice is supporting, that we're not undermining these relationships.
Thank you, Jennifer. In that same lens, could you address the question, did you hear from any of the youth voices in Minnesota from the Youth Voices group when you had the site visit?
We did not, and that's a thing that keeps me up at night because when we went to the site visit, we learned about all the work that the foster care youth were doing in QPI and at Aspire, and so we actually put it in our feedback to QPI as well as other stakeholders, the importance of foster care youth, and so we had also talked with the funding agency. Annie E. Casey, to see if there was an opportunity to do another study, conduct another study where we're really hearing from the youth. And if I were to do this again, I would have made the youth voices top of the list, and I would have sought their opinions first and their perspectives. It would have been really interesting.
Great, thank you. Have there been direct conversations by workers with foster parents about race and class biases that may negatively impact relationships with birth parents?
I think that there has been, it depends on the site, right? Because for some sites, there are not racially and ethnically diverse populations. And so it's difficult to have that conversation. But one of the questions we did ask, because we also had focus groups, we asked about how race and ethnicity played a part in the way in which they interacted with foster parents as well as birth parents. And so there are some, I would say there are now studies that are coming out with different frameworks on how foster care agencies can have these conversations about differences in perceptions of parenting based on culture, based on race and ethnicity, and the beliefs around certain principles. And so that's something that's been happening in the last couple of years. But there, just to be helpful, there is something called the SHARP framework, and I can add that information to the chat. But it's a framework that helps providers have these conversations about race and ethnicity, as well as systematic oppression, and how that has contributed to experiences of families that are involved with child welfare.
And I just want to chime in and say that you're going to hear from QPI Minnesota tomorrow, and that QPI Minnesota has really been a leader around looking at race and equity issues and trying to work with the community, in particular the Black community in Minnesota, to change the conception of child welfare and foster care as an entity that destroys families, and saying this sort of new way of doing business in child welfare really is about preserving relationships. It's about strengthening families, and that is a pathway for getting families who are willing, able, and excited to work with other families who are coming from their community. So I think this is a critical topic, and this partnership between birth and foster parents, it's really key and critical in terms of preserving the child or youth culture, right? Their language, their cultural experiences. I know there are so many young people like me who lost language while they were in foster care, who lost sort of the opportunity to practice cultural traditions because there was no relationship with our birth families. So it is an important mechanism both to attract a type of foster parent who's willing and able to do that work and who comes from the communities our family come from, but also to have practices that really incorporate racial and cultural equity.
Thank you, Jennifer, and for foreshadowing QPI Minnesota tomorrow. And Dr. Lewis, if you are able to share that resource in the chat, that would be excellent.
Will do.
Okay, we have a few more minutes and a few more questions, so hopefully we can get to them all. Let's go with this one. Is there any data available to show that foster parent and birth parent partnerships lead to higher numbers of reunifications?
So there are a few studies that have some associations that when there are more collaborative relationships between foster parents and birth parents, that birth parents have they have perceptions of having more social support, that they gain confidence in their parenting and are more motivated to complete the tasks and the responsibilities needed for a foster family reunification. I can also add a few of those articles in the link as well, if you're interested.
And I would add on to Dr. Lewis and say that one of the things that we have done since Dr. Lewis did her study to sort of build on this idea that we really need better mechanisms to hear regularly from resource parents and birth parents and have that information go directly to the agency is we've launched a data initiative that we call Quality Parenting Outreach in partnership with Aikido Labs. And we survey foster parents about how practice implementation is actually going. So you don't just change practices and policy on paper, but you actually get to hear as an agency leader directly from families around whether things have changed. And one of our surveys was on the QPI practice of comfort calls. And we got back data from our site showing that when a comfort call happens and there's an early introduction and relationship between the birth and family, foster family, that there is there are improved rates of reunification, there's more receptiveness and support for reunification, and that process goes more smoothly, which was really exciting to us because we had heard that anecdotally, but we hadn't actually seen the data.
And to add on to Jennifer's point, we did have a part of the study was a focus group. And so it had several stakeholders from QPI who these were providers, these were foster parents, birth parents. And so we did ask about, what keeps you engaged in QPI in the process. And, there was mention of faster reunifications and being able to hear about those success stories, not only within their specific child welfare agency, but also across other QPI sites was really helpful. So there are hopefully, and I don't know, Jennifer, if you all are capturing that now, but this idea of shared storytelling, especially around the piece of pertaining to reunification.
Okay, thank you. We're getting a few more questions, but I'm gonna just roll with it and see if we can get to one or two more. So will QPI be rolled out in every child welfare agency?
I can answer that. I think our idea initially in launching the Quality Parenting Initiative was that we really needed to figure out what the culture, policy, and practice changes that would support every single child in care receiving the parenting that they need and that they deserve, and that evidence tells us is actually the most effective intervention. And so the only way we could do that was by working insights to do that. So, our goal is not for QPI to take over the world and be a thing in every child welfare agency, but it is to say that we think every child welfare agency needs to learn from the culture, practice, and policy changes that have been implemented in QPI, and that really all of those things should just be the way that we do business in foster care. So that's our goal, is not to have everyone doing QPI, but to really change the way we do foster care, so that when we have to, there's no other option but to use foster care, it is an experience that does not cause further harm to children. So that would be my answer, is that what I hope is that we are creating a new way of doing foster care.
Thank you, Jennifer. So are there any studies on how foster parents deal with single DAs as two moms? I don't know if Leroy might need to.
I'm thinking the question might have to do with dads.
Yep.
Stacey.
Yep. Is there any, go ahead. So are there any studies on how foster parents deal with single, dads or as compared to moms, perhaps?
So Jennifer, I don't know if you could answer this. I have not seen any studies as of recently, but I know that there is, these are questions that are actively being answered, specifically around single dads and their role in child welfare, and how to better engage fathers, but also best practices and strategies. Because I think sometimes in child welfare, when we say parents, a lot of studies then will have only mothers in the study, birth moms. And so there is active studies at this time, but no published findings that I can think of at this moment.
Yeah, and I'm not in the research world like Dr. Lewis is, but what I will say is that the body of evidence that is out there around relationships between foster parents and birth parents is very limited. Actually, it's part of the reason it's so excited that Dr. Lewis is able to contribute, because there's not a lot of research, period. And as Dr. Lewis said, most of that research actually sort of assumes that fathers don't exist. And so in our QPI work, we have a very specific and intentional focus, both on birth fathers, but also on foster fathers, because, it's sort of like men do not exist in this system, and they're a really important part of the equation. And it does require very specific and intentional approaches, and especially for dads of color, right? I always hear when you don't intentionally think about how to serve particular people, then you exclude them and you don't serve them well. And that is certainly true with our dads. So the practices are largely the same in terms of the agency, but they do require specific focus, intentionality, and customization, I guess is the best way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. We are out of time for questions, but Jory, Devin, and Eddie, we will put your questions in a parking lot document and see if Dr. Lewis and Jennifer are able to address any of those. And then we will share any resources mentioned throughout this presentation with the audience. And then let's see here. I'm gonna put Jennifer's contact in the chat for everybody, because up on the screen you can see Dr. Lewis's. And we are right on time. So thank you very much, Dr. Lewis and Jennifer, for joining us for this presentation. Please reach out with any questions.